Hello, this is Jerry Morton. Welcome to my Finding My Way podcast. This is podcast number 55, titled Tactics. Podcasts 34 through 61 are stories from the year of Army training I experienced. The training started in August 1966 and ended in June 1967. The stories are published in the book Reluctant Lieutenant, From Basic to OCS in the 60s, which was published by Texas A&M University Press as a military history. Podcast 55, Tactics, is an account of the training provided to infantry OCS candidates in the spring of 1967. The tactics included navigation, calling in artillery fire, being ambushed, making sure your men had all their field equipment, and the use of specialized weapons. It is recommended that you listen to the Army training stories in the order in which the podcast number presents them, so that you can appreciate the full contextual richness in this and later stories. Tactics. Now, draw on your map how you would have your platoon maneuver across the terrain to get from point A to your objective, the tactical instructor directed. When you have drawn your route on the map, bring it to me for review. The terrain map in front of me was pretty clear. There were steep hills between me and the objective I was supposed to reach with my platoon. The most obvious way to get there was through the narrow valley that ran through the ridge lines on both sides. It was so obvious that the enemy was sure to expect you to come that way. Every other possible route required you to go over steep hills, then down into other valleys, and then over more steep hills before finally going back down to the objective. No question about it. If I were trying to defend the objective, I would set up ambushes along that valley trail. Anyone coming down that trail had one hope of staying alive. They had to hope the enemy was not there. If he was, some or all of your men were going to get hit unless you could discover the ambush and ambush the ambushers. Risky business, no doubt about it. Obviously, you would not lead your men into an ambush. Surprise the enemy. Approach him from the unexpected position. Hannibal led his men over the Alps and conquered the Roman legions. Alexander the Great avoided certain defeat by staying away from a mountain pass. His men found a goat trail over the mountains. They surprised the waiting enemy force and routed it. I was not a great student of history, but the point here was obvious. The map's contour lines indicated that the top third of the hills on the left were quite steep. My men would go over the big hill on the right, down the ridge, and then slant up a climbing ridgeline on the next hill so they would not wear themselves out making a steep climb. Besides, it looked as if there was a slight dip in that ridgeline that would make it easier walking if the underbrush was not too thick. The map did not tell you what kind of vegetation existed on the hillsides. We would be tired after going over the two hills. Approaching our objective from the rear was worth it. If the enemy were there, we would have them by surprise. Best of all, it was not likely that we would be ambushed along the way. I was pleased with my solution. After I waited in line for a few minutes, my turn came to have my choice of routes graded. The solution was well marked on my map. Leaning over it as he sat at the grading table, the instructor said, "No, you want to go right down the valley. Your solution would take too long. It could be done your way, but it'd take too long." He scribbled 75% on it and said rather loudly, "Next." No one told me time was a factor in the problem. Well, if that was what they wanted, that was what I would put down for future solutions. Take the quickest route. Forget about avoiding likely ambush sites. "When ambushed, charge," the instructor said. "Some of you will get hit, but if all of you stay in the killing zone, everyone is dead. Charge through the killing zone and counterattack." Damn, that was a hell of a way to stay alive. We talked among ourselves. None of us was certain what we would actually do. It would depend upon the situation. Logic said that routinely running through the enemy's line of fire, straight into his blazing guns, was not always the best way to stay alive. The bleachers we were sitting in had been placed high on the ridge. Rolling hills stretched in every direction beneath us. This was so we could see where the mortar rounds we called for fell. Someone guess how far it is from here to that tree over there," the sergeant said, pointing at a lone tree standing on a low hill to our left front. No one spoke. Several of the guys were studiously avoiding making eye contact with the sergeant. We had spent the first 2 hours that morning being lectured to as we huddled in the bleachers. The early morning air was cold. Clouds blocked out the sun. A heavy mist was in the air. We had been allowed to put on our ponchos. We sank our faces into the neck of it. With the hood covering as much of your head and face as you could manage, the warm air of your breath was captured. It felt good. All of us had learned way back in basic, surrounded as you were by the warmth. It was easy to fall asleep. Many candidates did. Sometimes they would fall from their perch on the bleachers into the backs of those in front of them. If that guy was also dozing, it could have a domino effect. Occasionally, 4 or 5 guys would go down at a time. My poncho was pulled up over my nose, but I was determined not to fall asleep. The one thing you had to be able to do in Nam was call in accurately artillery fire. I had heard too many of the sergeants talking about artillery shells landing on the troops who had called in the strike. You just had to know exactly where you were, where the artillery was located, and where the enemy troops were. If they were attacking your position, calling for fire would blow them away. Your lives would be saved. Make a mistake, and the shells landed on you, or they landed on some harmless spot. The enemy then overran your position, and everyone was dead. Accuracy was important. They had formulas for plotting your position, the artillery's position, and the enemy's position. Once you had figured it all out on your grid map, you called in the coordinates and gave the order to fire. Grid numbers, distance to target, and compass headings were important bits of information. It was a complicated business. The price of a mistake was high. I asked a lot of questions. This was not like learning to lay a World War II type minefield in Germany. This was something I had to know. Yes, you, the sergeant said, pointing to me. Tell me how far it is from here to that tree. Sergeant, I really have no way of knowing. Please ask someone else. No, I'm asking you. Go ahead, son. Take a guess, he said as he motioned for me to come over to where he was standing with a Prick 25 radio. The mortars are behind that hill, he said, pointing behind us. They've got all the information they need except the distance to the target. Give me a figure. The hill we were on dropped steeply away right in front of us. Then, a long way down, it turned into a gentle slope leading up to the small hill on which the tree stood. I imagined I had a football field in front of me. I tried to picture it as it had looked in my high school playing days. Our football field was 100 yards long and continued on for an extra 20 yards before you got to the wall at the other end. I stretched that imaginary 120-yard football field straight in the air from my feet toward the tree, but it fell short. Fixing the point where the imaginary football field ended in my mind's eye, I extended the whole field out from that point. Following this procedure, I was able to estimate that the tree was 575 yards from our location. All of the mental calibrations had taken place within the span of a natural pause in a normal conversation. Sergeant, I'd say it's about 575 yards from here, but that's only a guess. Good. Call it in, he said, handing me the Prick 25's telephone receiver. Now, Sergeant, it was just a guess, I said, handing the phone back to him. He refused to take it. There was steel in his eyes. The smile had left his face. Call it in, he ordered. I did. Target, 575 yards. Fire one round. Then I handed the phone back to him. Watch the tree. There's a round coming in, he announced so that the groups of candidates scattered around would all watch. Behind us we heard the whoop sound of a mortar round leaving its tube. Several seconds later, blam! The round exploded in the top of the tree. I had hit the thing. I could not believe it. The sergeant said under his breath, Nice call. At the end of the week, we took our written exam for calling in artillery fire. I scored 98. It was my highest score since starting OCS, and it seemed to be the highest score of anyone in the company. Usually the MP hopeful or the English major got the top scores in the company. They wanted them and studied for them rather than interact with the guys in their platoon. I was surprised that I had beaten them on the test. Deep down, I still felt shaky about how to call for artillery support. When I got to Nam, I would have to get someone to help me. I sure did not want to get anyone killed because of my stupidity. We were out on patrol during one of the many field exercises they put us through. Nothing much doing but pushing through the underbrush. As usual, I was on point. I would rather be the point man, using my eyes to find the easiest way through the brush, rather than walking the hard way. The hard way was pushing through the thickest brush with all of its thorn and scratching branches, when you can see an easier way off to the side. Seeing a better path, but not being able to take it, is truly frustrating. Why the point man doesn't see it is the question. I had an eye for finding the best trail. I liked that task, and the guys often asked me to do it. It worked out all the way around. I could see a clearing up ahead. We were about to break out of the heavy brush. The clearing had tall grass and clumps of bushes here and there, with a few trees sprinkled in for good measure. When we broke into it, I pulled up, waiting for the acting platoon leader to determine how he wanted us to move across the open space. He decided he wanted us to form a wide line and walk through it to the tree line on the other side. We all expected to be ambushed on this patrol. Sometimes you were the pigeon. We sensed that this was a setup. We were to make somebody else's day. They had been told we would be coming toward them. We were going to give them the experience of pulling off a successful ambush at our expense. The most likely spot for an ambush was the tree line. If they opened up, we would be in a good position to return fire. The ground under the tall grass was rougher than usual. It seemed to rise up when you were not expecting it. There were clumps in it. They caught the toe of your combat boots. Thus the line was not straight. Hell, the line was never straight. Pow, 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 pow. Rifle and automatic weapon fire came from everywhere and out of the ground. Run, 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 someone shouted over the noise. People were yelling all over the place. I ran immediately. On my left, one of the guys from another platoon in the company came shoulder high out of the ground. He was firing his M14. As it fired, he swung the muzzle toward me. My forward momentum carried me across the trench in which he stood. I swung the barrel of my M14 down and opened up as I was making the leap. You're dead, Jerry! Fall down! I got you before you fired, he shouted. The hell you say? I cried back as I continued running. Damn, they were well camouflaged. I had never, oh God, I never would have seen them. Hell, I probably would have fallen into one of their trenches if the guy had not popped up. I don't know. I thought maybe he really did kill me. Maybe I was dead. Even if I was, there was no point in lying on the ground playing dead. I still had to stay with my platoon. If this had been Vietnam and real bullets were flying around, I most likely would be dead. A sobering thought. Anyway, now I understood what the sergeant meant about running through an ambush. When you know you are dead if you do not go through, you just go on through. Come on, Jerry. Nobody'll know, said Lane. This whole business is stupid. How many times have we been on a compass course? He was right, of course. There was no need to do another one. I had found every stake and was always one of the first guys to complete the day-long stretch through the woods correctly, following the compass headings they had given us. Lane wanted me to duck out with him. We would slip off into the woods, take a nap, have a couple of smokes, relax for the day. When the time was right, we would come out at the other end of the course as though we had just completed it. We would take the day off. I felt guilty about doing it, but Lane was awfully persuasive. Finally, I agreed. It was nice to catch up on a lost sleep. The day was not too cold. The sun was warm. There was no wind. It was just about perfect for napping. I could not shake the feeling of guilt, though. It ruined the day for me. Nate said he was quitting. My cubicle mate, my owl in the woods, was dropping out of OCS. I could not believe it. He would not tell me why. I offered to help him with any problems he might be having. I wanted him to stay. He was a good man. It did not make sense. He told Lieutenant Strauss the next morning. When we got back from the day's training, all of his gear was gone. I never saw him again. A week later, Jim and one of his cubicle mates said they were dropping out. Jim was one of the really cool guys. He was the one who played Atlas, holding up the building by standing on the top of the bunk with his back pressed against a ceiling beam when the senior candidates came around to harass us. He said that he had come to realize he did not want to be responsible for other men's lives. As an infantry lieutenant, that was just what he would be. I had never thought of it quite that way. He was right. I understood his reluctance. He did not want the responsibility. I was willing to accept it. Before we became senior candidates, around 35% of the guys in our platoon dropped out. That was about average for the company. As far as I could tell, all of them could have completed the program. They were good men. I had a hard time understanding it. There was just no time to ponder the situation. We had too many things to do to dwell on this phenomenon. We had another tactical maneuver for the day. In the pre-dawn hours, they trucked us out to the middle of nowhere. Lots of troops in the field. I was assigned to a squad made up of guys from a mixture of the other platoons. This was not unusual. They were constantly stirring us up. It was a rare treat to be in a squad or platoon with someone from your own platoon when you were out on maneuvers. In general, in the field, you had only a nodding acquaintance with the soldiers assigned to your group. You really never got a chance to get to know them as good friends. I guess that was why we did not care that much if the leader messed up. You did not feel close enough to any of them to make the effort to tell them they were making a mistake. Who needs someone mad at him? The tactical officers made our lives miserable enough. You did not knowingly need to add stress to your own life. Our group got its orders. We were to rendezvous at a point on the map by 1600 hours. It was a large clearing. Helicopters would be there to pick us up and fly us back to main post. It would be a real treat. If we did not get to the site, they called it the pickup zone, PZ, on time, or we got lost, they would take off without us. This time, I cared that the platoon leader read the map right. He had the map and the compass headings. I did not. He chose not to share the information with the rest of us. After taking his first sighting, we took off. By midday, we all knew we were lost. Finally, I got a chance to look at the map. Since our leader could not identify our starting point, it was rather academic as to where we were now. This made getting to where we were supposed to be at 1600 hours problematic. We had an interesting debate as we tried to read the topographical map. Attempting to match what we saw around us to the map's terrain features and then guessing where we were at that moment was a stress-inducing experience. Finally, we reached a consensus. In approximately an hour's march, if our speculations were right, we would cross a fairly large stream bed. We were wrong. Clearly, we were badly lost. The platoon leader had a little trouble recognizing that fact. The rest of us did not. His failure to admit the obvious must have been the result of the weight of leadership. We finally decided to just keep moving north. The platoon leader did not like our solution, but he agreed to it rather than continue the patrol on his own. By following a northerly heading, we would eventually come to a gravel road. We would wait there until an Army vehicle came by. That was better than running around the boonies for a couple of days without food or iodine tablets for water purification. At 1500 hours, one of the guys said he could hear chopper engines. We stopped and listened. It sure sounded like it, but we could not be quite sure. We changed our course and started moving toward the sound. It got stronger. At 1530 hours, we broke out of a tree line into a large clearing. There were the helicopters. The captain in charge of loading up the troops congratulated us on making such good time. We graciously accepted his praise. Inspection seemed to be an important part of being tactical. A combat unit needs all of its equipment, and that equipment needs to be in good working order. We were to have a full field gear inspection. A lieutenant colonel or a full colonel would be coming through all the platoon bays to inspect. This inspection is important, the TACs told us. We had better do well. Of course, we would first have to unspit-shine our floors for the inspection. It was only the TACs who wanted the floors spit-shined. The senior brass did not want us to spend our time doing it. When they inspected, the floors could not be spit-shined. There was a special problem to be overcome for this inspection. None of the platoons had been issued all of its field gear. Most of us lacked entrenching tools. Each man was to have one half of a pup tent. We had 0 halves. The list of missing items seemed endless. No matter, the word from Captain Green, the company commander, was that we had to pass the inspection. One of the guys in 1st or 2nd platoon had a couple of friends in an OCS company several barracks away that had successfully completed a similar inspection. They had done it by borrowing their missing equipment from a lot of other OCS companies. Their tactical officers did not seem to know that the equipment they displayed for their inspection was primarily borrowed equipment. At least, no one openly told them about it, and they never asked. The point was to pass the inspection, so they did. There was a lot of after-hour smuggling. We finally completed the acquisition phase 2 days before the inspection. The hard part was trying to determine where to lay each piece out on your bunk. The word we got on how to do it kept changing. The entrenching tool seemed to be a favorite. At first it was at the top of the bunk with the handle down. Then the handle was up. Next, it was to be sideways in the middle of the bunk with the folded tent half directly above it. There were several more location changes after that. Since everyone was to do the same for the entire company, the minuteness change in the placement of any item meant a monumental effort had to be mounted to get the word out to every candidate. Right off, half the company would get the wrong message. Then, when the correct message came, many of those who had gotten it right the first time thought it was a new change, so some of them changed their layout while others did not. Further attempts to get it right inevitably caused other guys to get the wrong message, making them think they were wrong when they really had it right. It got so bad that we finally had just one person get the word out. That person went to each bunk to see that whatever it was placed right. We were still making changes as the inspecting major, not a colonel after all, walked in. The company passed. I had managed to obtain all of our field gear. It made me wonder if stateside combat units in the real Army went through a similar charade to pass their combat readiness inspections. Were they really ready to engage the enemy, or was all of their equipment on temporary loan from other units? I guess it was okay if only one of the units was called up on 24 hours notice for combat. I would hate to be about to go into combat if 3 or 4 units had to be called up. We might find out what was really meant by the phrase, a paper army. I liked firing the .50 caliber machine gun the best. You could squeeze off just one round at a time or pop off a whole string by firmly pressing on the butterfly trigger. A sergeant told us that some guys in Nam were so good with it that they could hit a VC 2 miles away. They would have a .50 caliber set up to guard a base camp. The gunners generally could spot a Viet Cong 2 miles away if he were standing on some open ground. You could see the guy get hit. He would fly off of his feet. He was so far away, the sound of the gun firing would not reach where his body lay until long after the bullet arrived. They had us fire off the .50 caliber machine gun from the top of a cliff. Some old armor personnel carriers, APCs, were sitting on the low ground about a mile away. The task was to hit an APC. We were firing rounds capable of piercing the armor. If the APC were full of troops, the bullets would ricochet inside of it. A lot of men would be hit. If I were in an APC and heard a .50 caliber going off, I would start sweating. The wired-guided anti-tank missile was a bust. You hop into a bunker and look through the concrete slits. There's a button to push and 2 little levers to pull back and forth. One lever controls whether the missile goes to the left or the right. The other one controls its height of flight. Perhaps it's the reverse. The instructions seemed clear enough at the bleachers. In the bunker, it was another story. "Any questions?" asked the sergeant beside me as I looked through the bunker slits at the couple of APCs downrange. Which one makes it go to the left?" I asked, trying not to be overly concerned. "Don't worry. Instinct takes over. Firing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. It's off and running. I can see the 2 guide wires reel out as I reflexively fiddle with the 2 levers. The missile bounced off the ground a couple of times and veering to the right. Magically, it straightened out to fly intricately between all of the APCs without putting a scratch on them. The sounds of the spinning, empty guide wire spools brought me back to the bunker. "Next!" shouted the sergeant. Later, sitting inside a tank gave me a new level of respect for tankers. There are so many easy ways to get hurt inside one. When the gun turret moved to sight in a target, the loader could accidentally have his arm on the large gear-like track. Zap! His arm is off. When the cannon fires, if anyone is directly behind it, he is peanut butter on the wall. The recoil from the gun would do an eye-blinking quick job on him. When the shell casing popped out of the breech, it flies out. Put your head in its way and your head is gone. Let a live cannon shell get loose and roll around on the floor, and you would be thankful if you got off with only a broken leg. The round could go off. Naturally, tanks were usually moving when they're in a firefight. They bounce around a lot, hard. Any crew member could bounce his teeth off of a metal wall or crack his head on a protruding piece of something. In addition, the smoke from the main gun firing is blinding, suffocating, and toxic. Anyone with a touch of claustrophobia would be in trouble inside a tank. Heaven to a tanker must be the sweet smell of fuel rising in the cabin while a cigarette dangles from his lips. It is okay to smoke because he is already dead. No thanks. I would rather be in the infantry.